Donate, fools. When I made my first video on God of War, it was a think piece that was made to highlight the character of Kratos, because the public misconception, specifically in the realms of online games journalism, aka the corpse that keeps on twitching, I found, was that people like to claim that Kratos in the original run of God of War games was nothing more than a brutish monster with the character depth of a spoon. I disagreed and made a video discussing what I felt were the hidden depths of his character. Some things that were patently bloody obvious, some things that were hidden and required a bit of reading between the lines, and some things that were hidden away in the excellent prequel games that apparently nobody really played. But there was naturally some pushback, which I expected, a lot of which came down to this. How could you possibly say that Kratos is a deep character? Look at all the horrible things he did even before he became a monster. Which, first, one does not beget the other, and second, I think that's a misguided attitude, because you have to look at things within context. I believe within the universe that he existed, Kratos was pretty much fully justified in everything he did. There's a lot to unpack in that sentence. Well, first of all, let's discuss what it means to be a hero, the modern understanding versus the archaic understanding. Our modern understanding of what it means to be a hero is very fixed. There's a certain absolutism to how morality is portrayed today, the belief that there are certain lines you cannot cross before you simply can't be considered in any way a good person anymore. For example, killing is one of the worst possible things you can do, which is further built on a belief that's only sprouted up in the past 100 years or so that violence should be a last option, which is not necessarily a bad thing to believe. Despite mass media lampshading every atrocity that takes place, we live in the most civilized age ever, and that reflects in the media we see created. The problem is though, moral absolutism doesn't leave any space for nuance, and I think there's a lot more nuance to this discussion. It wasn't that long ago, maybe during my grandfather or great-grandfather's day, that violence wasn't just accepted, it was expected. This might make me sound psychotic, but it's true. At least from the perspective of fictional media, you should be able to look at the actions of characters from a perspective beyond that of modernity. Morality is an entirely contextual thing that changes from situation to situation and era to era. And the first thing that really sells Kratos' actions as in their own way justifiable is the fact that he's not a modern hero or anti-hero, neither in setting nor style of writing. Kratos is a classic example of a Greek hero. Now let's talk about Greek tragedy for a second. I'm no expert on the topic, so I might get a few things wrong here, but I've attempted to do enough research to present my argument. But if I do get anything wrong, feel free to let me know. Greek tragedy, as the name might imply, is a type of fiction that was very prevalent during ancient Greece and has played a large role in the development of storytelling and literature through to the modern era. The simple summation of a Greek tragedy is a play in which the protagonist, usually a person of importance and outstanding personal qualities, falls to disaster through a combination of personal failing and circumstances which he or she cannot control. And Greek tragedies were generally known to have strict structural and artistic guidelines they adhered to. They began with a prologue before introducing its characters in the parados. You would have a chorus to comment on or explain the story at hand, like what we in the modern day understand as a narrator. Granted, they also sang, but that's besides the point. These stories included such elements as a sudden reversal of fortune where the protagonist's downfall is instigated by either the gods, their own tragic flaws, or both in some cases, which eventually leads to a conclusion where they're transformed by their experience. And in many cases, but not always, they had a tragic ending. So here's the thing, God of War is Greek tragedy, or at least it's a modern take on the concept. It has some artistic license, but it's generally part of this realm of fiction. The story of Kratos is the type of story that, with some adjustments, may have been recited at the festival of Dionysus in ancient Athens, spoken by a famous playwright, such as Euripides or Acephalus. And as such, the structure of the game as well as the personality of Kratos is meant to emulate the stories of that era. Otherwise, it would be historically dishonest and would cease to be a Greek-style tragedy and would just be a modern-style tragedy. One of the key elements of the Greek tragedy is the quote-unquote hero. Fictional figures characterized by their desire to strive for greatness, but would end up being brought down by an inescapable fate, but more importantly, their own personal failings, otherwise known as a tragic flaw, or a hamartia. I think that's how that's pronounced. To my knowledge, this was a relatively universal thing in this style of fiction. For example, Odysseus in the Odyssey was characterized by his hubris, or in the Iliad, Achilles is characterized by his lack of emotional stability, although interpretations tend to vary on that one. It's no secret that Kratos has a key flaw which drives his story from the beginning, which is obviously his rage, which fuels a relentless ambition so strong that not even the gods or fate can stop him. When he sees red, so does everyone else. He has multiple flaws, but his relentless rage begets all those flaws. His pride, his unwavering desire to become stronger and more powerful, his brashness and thoughtlessness, which are all the fuel that light the fire of his tragic moments. That relentless ambition is what made him so desperate in his moment of defeat that he would sell his soul to overcome his foe. And later on, his aggressive contempt for the weak and his wrathful scorn for anybody who worshipped anyone other than Ares was what pushed him to conquer an innocent village, which ultimately begets the moment of his downfall. What I'm getting at here is that it's a contemporary series of games that tries to have a non-contemporary hero, one that's more accurate to the fictional heroes of the era in which the game is set. So while I would never be as egotistical as to say you're wrong for thinking Kratos is irredeemable based on his actions, it is slightly misguided to judge him based on contemporary ideas of heroes and heroism in general when that wasn't what they were going for. But even beyond the structure and style of story these games are attempting to tell, there's also the matter of the setting. These games are set in a much more brutal era of human history when life was cheap, the world was gruesome, and might made right. Life and morality was a much different thing back when glory and heroism was obtained on the battlefield by conquering land and taking no mercy on those who were different to you. So in a piece of media that's set in ancient Greece and attempts to have any level of historical accuracy as far as the personalities involved, to expect a character's morality to be in any way aligned with that of a more modern sense is misguided, because it was a much different thing back then. Can you really judge a character in this setting based on the standards of morality that's only been the standard for less than 100 years? Many criticisms of his character can be countered with this point in my opinion. You could of course have these characters acting in a more contemporary sense if you wanted, but you might have ended up in a situation like the notoriously anachronistic Rise Son of Rome where the tone clashes with the setting. Especially when you take into account that Kratos is not only of an ancient bygone era, but he's also a Spartan. Sparta is probably the most notorious war state in the entire history of the world. It was a brutal culture both for the people they fought and for the people within the culture. First of all being their treatment of those unfit for service. You see, in ancient Sparta, all newly born children would be inspected by a council for physical defects. The belief used to be that if they were deemed unfit for eventual service in the military, they would be thrown into a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, although that's been largely debunked, and the belief nowadays is that the unfit infants were simply left for dead. Wow, so much better! This is canon to the God of War series because in one of the comics, one of the plots involved Kratos going on a quest to find Ambrosia to heal his ailing daughter Calliope before she was deemed unfit and he was forced to leave her for dead. Furthermore, male Spartans were expected to start rigorous military training from age 7, even forced to survive on their own from age 12 with nothing but a red cloak. There were ritualistic beatings, ridicule, extreme cultural restrictions, and so on, all for the sole purpose of making able-bodied men as hardened and ready for war as possible. In fact, your active duty was so important, Spartan men couldn't even live with their wives until they turned 30. Essentially, you were expected to kill and die for Sparta, and were expected to be hardened as hell. You see this in God of War during the flashback scenes in Ghost of Sparta where Kratos is beating and hazing his younger brother for being weak, but ultimately to make him stronger and more ready for his active duty, not for any malicious reasons. In this regard, Kratos is probably one of the most accurate interpretations of a Spartan soldier in the history of fiction, at least before he has chain blades fused to his arms. Because he's brutal, he's ruthless, and he's a killing machine. But to say that makes him evil in itself ignores a very important piece of context that this was just the culture he was part of. Everybody in his command was likely almost exactly like him because they've all been through the exact same harsh regimen. We just happen to be seeing his story. The things he was doing were not villainous, but rather the things that were expected of him in that era and of a person in his position. It was simply par for the course. You don't go through that type of upbringing without becoming numb to the horrors and brutalities of the world. I remember I once made the point that young Kratos kinda looks like Jimmy Hopkins from Bully. Honestly though, if Kratos was born in the modern day, he probably would have been on the level of a Jimmy Hopkins. Troubled and slightly insane, but by no means evil. Then once he teamed up with Ares, his personality combined with his newfound power and corruption at the hands of Ares only made him stronger and more brutal. A lot of people died here and he did a lot of horrible things, but much of that was at the behest of Ares, whom Kratos owed his life to. But there's a case to be made that he's not supposed to be a good guy here. You're not supposed to agree with what he's doing. They're building him up for his eventual downfall, and quite the downfall it was. That's where I stand. I don't believe these flashbacks are meant to show him in a flattering manner. This was him, for a time, at his most brutal and evil. It's not justifiable, but it's not supposed to be. It's all about that alliance making him irredeemable. Then there's the troubling matter of all the things he does in the 10 years preceding his battle with Ares. And granted, there are some things that were questionable, the whole ship captain thing springs to mind, but to be fair, that was hilarious. That said, I can't justify that. That was truly an unnecessarily heinous action. However, most of what he does, good or bad, leading up to his battle with Ares was simply a means to an end. I think we've all done some things we're not proud of in order to get from point A to point B in our lives. I certainly have, and Kratos is definitely not proud of the reputation he got as the Ghost of Sparta, both as a servant to Ares and a servant to the other gods. The only thing is, to get from point A to point B, there's a lot of brutality that has to take place because that's simply the world he lives in and the cards he's been dealt based on where he's ended up. But at the end of the day, it's all just a means to an end in order to get what he wants, his parole. Even that guy you have to burn alive in Pandora's temple is a necessary evil to make progress towards your ultimate goal. A goal that you're pursuing at the behest of the gods. It's made abundantly clear that none of this is what he wants. In Ascension, they make it clear that his greatest desire is just to live a normal life with his late wife and child. Which admittedly was a bit of a retcon because that game came much later, but still, it is canon and it doesn't contradict anything. Despite everything that's happened to him and everything that he's been forced to do, he's still a human with human desires. Some might claim the fact that Kratos can kill innocent civilians might invalidate any potential moral high ground he could ever have, but I dispute that because that takes place entirely within gameplay. You're forced to kill monsters, but you're entirely within your right to ignore the civilians and let them live, which I often do because I can't be asked. Unless they happen to get in the way of my attacks, or my attacks happen to auto-track to them, which is not unheard of. But either way, I don't consider these canon murders because it's entirely optional. In that case, it's on you, the player, not Kratos. Now let's move on to the big sticking point with a lot of people, and that is to say Kratos' actions after the first God of War game, which to be fair, many of his actions post God of War are heinous, even when you take into account all the context. But I argue once again, it's not necessarily him, he's just a victim of circumstance in a lot of these cases. His abuse at the hands of the gods influenced everything that he did in his later life. We've already gone over this multiple times, being led on by the gods and forced to do all their dirty work for 10 years under false pretenses, being denied salvation, being denied the ability to bring himself peace, forced to become a god and do a job he didn't really want to do, then being killed and having his homeland destroyed for the crime of refusing to fall in line with Zeus. Thinking about it, Zeus took it upon himself to kill Kratos personally when he wouldn't even lift a finger to kill Ares when he went insane, so that just speaks to the murderous contempt that Zeus had for Kratos. It was of course later established that Zeus as well as the rest of the gods were corrupted by Pandora's box, but seeing as the gods were messing with Kratos long before Pandora's box was opened, I'd say that doesn't really mean all that much. I mean, kidnapping Deimos and putting a curse on Kratos' mother, 10 years of thankless dirty work without even intending to give Kratos what he wants, this was all done before Pandora's box. So if anything, the corruption just enhanced their negative attributes. And here's food for thought. If the corruption from Pandora's box applies to the gods, and is their ultimate excuse, it could very well apply to Kratos as well. He just happened to have the power of hope as well to bring him back from the brink. Quite frankly, Kratos' desire to kill Zeus is probably the most justified thing in the entire series, and his beef was only with Zeus. He said as much at the end of God of War 2.
I do not seek to destroy Olympus, only Zeus.
Zeus is Olympus.
There are multiple gods he went out of his way to try and spare, but they kept poking the bear, and Kratos in this analogy is a bear who also happens to have a loaded shotgun. His body count would have been a lot lower had people just gotten out of his way. I mean, if you were someone like Hermes or Hephaestus and have already seen Kratos kill half the Greek pantheon, what chances do you have? Especially when you're someone like Hermes who was going out of his way to be a dick. Kratos had enough contempt for Hermes that he wanted to leave him be. He actively tried to talk Hercules out of fighting, and Hera was another one he tried to walk away from before she hit him where it hurt. The only god that I fully disagreed with Kratos killing was Hephaestus, because Hephaestus was completely justified in that Kratos was about to sacrifice Hephaestus' only offspring. He does the same thing that Kratos would have done if the roles were reversed. And in fact, Kratos does attempt to spare Pandora later on when he has second thoughts when Pandora is directly responsible for bringing Kratos back from the brink of the abyss he found himself in. Still, I maintain that by this point you're not supposed to be sympathizing with Kratos because he's become such a murderous monster that he loses sight of his intentions, losing his humanity and becoming a monstrous being of pure intent. I maintain that you're not actually supposed to like or side with Kratos in God of War 3, at least not after a while. At the beginning, you're supposed to be on the same page as him, getting into the macho power fantasy vibe, so that when Gaia betrays you, you're supposed to be like, yeah, fuck Gaia, fuck Zeus, I'll kill them all. But then there's supposed to be a growing sense of unease as the game goes on, and Kratos performs bigger and bigger atrocities on innocent people, creating a deliberate disconnect between Kratos and the player as he continually crosses the line over and over, which concludes with the harrowing and disturbing Poseidon's princess sequence. I've already covered this at length, so I won't dwell, but this is the part of the game that I've always remembered more than any, which is why I think it's where they intended for the other shoe to drop. This is furthered to me because of how these games generally treat women. People tend to call the original run of God of War games misogynistic, and you're entitled to your opinion, but I think that's a bit asinine considering that Kratos generally doesn't discriminate in who he kills. But he kind of does actually. Because I can count on one hand the amount of goddesses or women in general that he kills in a gratuitous fashion. Kratos doesn't rip the Sisters of Fate apart in the same way that he ripped apart Hermes, for example. Poseidon gets his eyes gouged out and his neck snapped, Athena accidentally gets stabbed through the chest and falls to pieces with dignity, and Hera just gets her neck snapped. And we know that Kratos has respect for women, considering that women generally had a lot of respect in Spartan culture, and we know for a fact that the two most special people in his life were his wife and daughter. You can make the case that the games themselves don't have as much respect for women as Kratos does, but that's all far too large a discussion for this video and a topic that I'm not well versed in enough to draw an educated conclusion, but I think taking that all into account is why the depiction of this death is so harrowingly violent, and why it so perfectly illustrates Kratos' fall from grace. And I think without proper context, it's very easy to have a black and white outlook on scenes like this, but that's why I think it's worth looking into the greater minutiae of the series to see how scenes like this play into the larger world and what the true intent was. Even before this, the signs of Kratos' mental state were there, like when he killed Perithous to get the bow that he was actively offering Kratos in exchange for his freedom. It's a case where the ends do not justify the means, despite the ends being somewhat reasonable given the context. He's destroying the world and killing everyone on his way to get to Zeus, but Zeus is just the end goal, and Kratos has become such an inhumane monster that all he sees is the end goal, and everything to get to that point is just collateral damage. That's where Kratos stops being fully justified and his actions have become impossible to defend. But that's the point. He was once a man, now he's become a monster worse than anything he's fought against. These are all things that I've covered in the past, and the funny thing is, people might claim that God of War PS4 is ashamed of the old games. I dispute that because they don't treat Kratos as a monster who deserves to be killed. They treat his past as horrid and brutal, but specify that Kratos was justified in his actions against the gods. Mimir says as much.
Oh, don't mistake me, brother. From what I heard, the Pantheon had it coming. It's still a bit to take in.
The only thing that shows any potential shame is the fact that Kratos has remorse for his actions, which is where his entire character arc in God of War PS4 stems from. Which is honestly the best balance they could have struck, because while he did give the Greek gods what was coming to them, his methods of getting there were questionable at best, completely fucking psychotic at worst. None of this is mental gymnastics. All of this is present within the games. These are all undeniable core concepts explored by the series. I'm not saying all of his actions were justifiable, nor am I trying to claim that he was a hero because he had the big sad. All I'm saying is that there's a lot more nuance to this discussion than comes across a lot of the time. Everyone will have their own interpretation, but I believe that if you look into the style of writing, the historical context, the narrative progression, the actions of the characters and the world around him, most of what Kratos did in the series was either not the fault of Kratos himself or was justified in some way. Then there comes the point, which will vary from person to person, where his actions become too much to bear, but it's clear that you're not supposed to sympathize with him anymore. I've trotted this path quite well before, and my hope here is simply that people will look at the facts and draw their own conclusions rather than regurgitate what they've been told by other people. Everybody is free to think whatever they want. If you disagree with me whatsoever, that's totally fine, but I also think that it's better to draw a conclusion once the facts are presented and considered. Was any of this intended by the developers, or was this a series of unintentional details, and the developers were just going out of their way to make an incredibly brutal and violent series of games? I can't say for sure, but I'd like to think that the people in charge of making these games were smart enough that these details weren't an accident. But who knows? This could have been the intended vision for a single person that nobody else thought twice about, or it could have been a group effort where the vision played out exactly as intended. Hell, this could have been a stumbled dick first into success situation. What I do know is that's all I got for this topic. Hopefully in the future there can be more nuance to this discussion than has been presented in the past. Not everything is black and white. Although to be fair, Kratos has been both. Heyo! I'm ashamed of myself. I've been the King of Snark Style, and if you like what I do, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit that bell icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing, and leave a comment telling me what you think. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, please consider donating to my Patreon, like these people on screen. Also, an extra special thank you to user Enutsu for going above and beyond. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Peace!